This video will inevitably include spoilers for stories in Final Fantasy XIV at varying levels of progression. What exactly qualifies as a spoiler in Final Fantasy XIV? The most accurate answer, of course, will vary from person to person. However, I would still like to discuss what could count as a spoiler, just to jog the conversation a bit. Obviously, this video will absolutely include spoilers as examples, so this is your final warning. Now, I will be outlining a few examples and qualify why it could be considered a spoiler, and then qualify why people might not consider it a spoiler. The aim is to start with things I imagine most players will agree are not a spoiler, and then gradually move over to things that are more likely to be considered spoilers. So, for the first example, your friend has just started playing Final Fantasy XIV. They choose to play a thaumaturge because their description of this class sounds cool. You then bring up how a black mage is super cool because of how it learns this spell called Flare. Assuming this friend never looked up anything, they would surely be very surprised to learn that a thaumaturge turns into a black mage later down the line. And should they open their action list as a thaumaturge, they would have no indication whatsoever that Flare is a spell that even exists at all. Hence, you spoiled them of the surprise that they become a black mage, and the surprise of learning Flare, whether they naturally discovered it by looking through their action list or by doing the quest and learning it. However, I believe the vast majority of people will not consider this a spoiler because it is more so just a mechanical thing in the game, and it is not really story related. I do think there is a very small selection of people that might consider this a spoiler though. For the second example, you show your friend a video of someone doing the dungeon Aurum Vale, long before they ever had the opportunity to do this optional dungeon themselves. Notably, you simply show them someone completing the dungeon, and the context of the dungeon is not provided, however much there is. Some players would view this as a spoiler, as they are now spoiled of the opportunity to experience every single encounter in the dungeon for the first time themselves when they go there. This kind of player would probably view watching a boss or dungeon guide as a spoiler as well in the same way, regardless of whether the story context is provided or not. I do believe most players would not consider this a spoiler because of multiple factors. No story context is provided, Aurum Vale has next to no story significance in the grand scheme of things, and it's not like these bosses have any particularly big twists in their boss mechanics. In fact, Aurum Vale is littered with very evil features and mechanics that can be very hard to follow without knowing them already beforehand, such as fruits to reset a debuff or the patrols of the first room, and while the second boss no longer has this, Coin Counter used to have no telegraphs for its attacks, so you just had to know the attack shapes. So while being spoiled to how the fights work could be considered a spoiler, I believe most players would not really view this as an issue. Remember, we are working our way up to bigger spoilers. The third example, you tell your friend about how in Shadowbringers there is this optional alliance raid that features characters and content from the Nier Automata series. You might tell very briefly about some of the things that happen, or even show one of the raids. This can be considered a spoiler because, well, this completely removes the possibility your friend is surprised by the existence of this alliance raid. However, on the other hand, I think most players will argue that this falls into a grey area of spoilers. The existence of this alliance raid could be a significant selling point, motivating your friend to progress through the game. And, as the content is entirely optional and very missable, making them aware of the existence of this content greatly increases the possibility that they ever get to see it in full. Hence, I believe most players would excuse the spoiler with the argument that their friend would never try or find the content without seeking it out intentionally. The fourth example is very similar, but changes the battlefield slightly. You tell your friend about the optional Trial series, the weapons storyline. In particular, you might tell them about the Emerald Weapon fight, or even just show them the fight with no context provided. This could be considered a massive spoiler in general, because the weapons are a reference to a different Final Fantasy game. Your friend is losing out on this surprise that the weapons are in this game too, assuming they played, for example, Final Fantasy VII. The fight also includes Gaius Van Baelza, making this somewhat of a significant story fight despite being optional. And if your friend pays very close attention, they might realize that Gaius is not only alive off-screen, but is on your side. Meaning, this could be a gigantic spoiler depending on where your friend is in the story. I imagine a significant portion of players would argue this could be considered a spoiler. At the same time, a significant portion of players might argue that, as this is an entirely optional storyline, without highlighting something spectacular from it, your friend might never bother to even see it in the first place. However, I do think the player base would lean more towards spoilers than not in this case. For the fifth example, you show your friend footage without context of a main scenario significant dungeon. For example, you might show them the dungeon Siren Song C. This dungeon is a main quest dungeon and even features some scions with you on the ship you start on. Well, it at least used to before the rework, so this could be considered a spoiler based on that alone. On the other hand, with no context provided, your friend will probably not view this as a particularly big spoiler unless they happen to be exactly on the bit of the MSQ where they're just about to board this boat to begin with. And even so, surprise, surprise, there's a dungeon associated with crossing the sea is perhaps not the most cataclysmically significant spoiler. Despite being more directly significant to the main story than the Emerald Weapon example, I'm pretty confident people would lean more towards not a spoiler here. For the sixth example, your friend sees footage of some sort of optional fight that involves an NPC that is considered very significant to the main story. For example, they see footage of P11 featuring Themis. However, no context is provided, so the only spoilers we may observe is anything provided up front by the fight itself. We are literally in the Chamber of the 14, with the chairs visibly there. This means that if your friend knows the significance of this, that alone can be a spoiler. Themis being the true name of Elidibus is another thing, but this is not really brought up outside of the optional Endwalker raid series, which does however mean that the importance and significance of this particular entity Themis is next to nothing, unless your friend knows who that is. I believe this is an excellent example of a spoiler where the player base would be very split on whether it is a spoiler or not. And personally, I think it is a kind of encounter where whether it actually is a spoiler depends far more on how far the friend is in the story. If they know about the Chamber of the 14, or would recognize it, this might be a big spoiler. If they have started the raid series, it would certainly be a spoiler. The seventh example is when it starts to get very spicy. Your friend sees footage of an extremely main story significant dungeon, however, without context. They might see dead ends. That means they would see Meteon and some of her dialogue. If your friend knows who Meteon is, then this is a massive spoiler right out the gate. However, if not, then the absurdity of the dungeon itself might make it nearly impossible to follow any logic in the dungeon in the first place. And it might as well just be nonsense, almost like Smileton. Regardless of that notion, I imagine a lot more players would call the Dead Ends a major spoiler dungeon than not, and I understand why. In fact, this is a dungeon I try to avoid using footage of specifically because of concerns like this. And for the eighth example, your friend sees a major piece of MSQ content with context provided. In some cases, context might not even be necessary. Your friend sees the fight with Hydaelyn. It doesn't even matter when in the MSQ your friend is, this would be considered a spoiler, and I think most everyone will agree on that. I don't really have any argument as to how or when this would not be considered a spoiler. Now, having already kind of reached the limit, I would finish with a bit of a wildcard for the ninth example, using a mount, a minion, or an outfit that could be a significant story spoiler somehow. For example, the E8S mount that looks exactly like E5's Ramuh, which looks similar enough that some players might recognize it as Ramuh from A Realm Reborn. Bringing out the wind-up Mistle, which looks similar enough to Grahatia, and the Crystal Exarch, depending on where you are in the story. Or wearing, for example, the 2B outfit in full could spoil the existence of the Near raid which we spoke about earlier. Now, I consider this a wildcard because honestly I don't really see them as big spoilers, since as long as the new player doesn't look up the item, it doesn't go further than a cool looking mount that seems oddly familiar, or an interesting minion that looks oddly familiar, and the fact that there might have been a crossover even with Nier Automata, that might as well be a store outfit as suggests there exists an Alliance raid series, right? And with all these examples lined out, I want to finish with 2 simple considerations. Again, each person views spoilers differently and is more or less impacted by them, so if you disagree with my assessment on some of these things, that's perfectly fine. So the first consideration is that at some point, it seems only natural to assume that anyone that cared about not being spoiled on something had their chance to check it out. Meaning, for example, that one day we might see Heidelberg's fight a lot more casually talked about as it ages, despite the sheer amount of spoileriness it contains. The second consideration is that showing someone who is in A Realm Reborn content from around Stormblood or Shadowbringers and beyond, as long as it doesn't involve characters the Sprout knows significantly well, for them it might be as relevant as overhearing a conversation between people talking about someone that they don't know, as long as not too much context is provided. You could reasonably discuss some story beat involving Lise without spoiling the Sprout who only knows Ida separately. And by the time they reach Stormblood, they probably have forgotten this meaningless conversation about this character they didn't recognize anyway. And if they do reach Stormblood so fast they remember, they might not have paid that much attention to the story, so it probably didn't matter anyway. This is why, when I find myself in dead ends in a stream, for example, I try to tell the Sprouts in Endwalker to consider averting their eyes and ears for a bit, but for the rest, it is probably mostly meaningless. At least, this is what I believe, and I would love to hear what your perspective is on this too, so do let me know in the comments. But with that said, I hope you found this discussion interesting. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, or perhaps fun tip. If you do accidentally spoil your Sprout friend on some story stuff, my recommendation to throw them off is to include false information, so that they don't know for sure whether what you just spoiled for them even is true in the first place. Try it, but be careful you don't go too far, right?